Hello, my Sunday. This chart up is from Deutsche Bank, and it is the 5-year total return performance of major global financial assets. Things you could have bet on over the last 5 years and how they've done, upsies and downsies. Why 5 years now? Because it's kind of the Financial Times has decided that it's the 5-year anniversary of the credit crunch. Now, I'd put it a bit earlier when the Bear Stearns hedge funds ran into trouble. But Financial Times, being more European-based, they go for the BNP Paribas money market funds closing, which was obviously in August. So 5 years on from then, if you'd invested on that day, 5 years later, what asset class has done the bestest? So the sticky up ones are obviously the goodies, and the sticky down ones are the baddies. So let's have a quick look. Corn is number one, just above gold. Corn, I imagine, because it's taken a late surge with the drought in the United States. So I think it's come along and gone whoosh right at the end to beat gold over the 5-year period. Silver comes in next. Brent is next. That's Brent oil, crude oil, as representing the oil market, the price of a barrel. What have we got next? USIG non-fin. That's United States. IG is investment grade non-financial bonds. So it looks like the light blue. Let's look over, gilts next. Gilts are UK treasuries, that's in grey, sticking up. US corporation sticks up there in light blue. So light blue are bonds issued by companies. Sticky up grey are bonds issued by countries. The dark blues are commodities. Sticky up red, FTSE, Bovespa and S&P. The reds are equities, and there's blacks there, which is money you can make on the Forex market, or at least over these 5 years, money that you're going to lose on the Forex market because they stick downwards. And over towards the end, all those reds sticking down are all stock markets, they're all equities. So corn, gold, silver, oil, commodities win. Then it's fixed income securities, bonds. You buy a bond for a fixed income, fixed interest rate securities. And surprisingly, the FTSE is the best performing stock market, right down there towards the skinny bit. Corn, corn, okay. I don't know, that'll probably be, I don't know if corn even got a spot price. I think they deal so much in the futures market that, but I imagine if it has a spot price, it's spot price to spot price. But talking of futures, okay, futures. Lots of Chicago Commodities Exchange deal in futures. They deal in lots of things, but that was their speciality in the beginning. That a future is a derivative. It's a derivative of the actual stock, or the actual, in this case, corn. It's the actual stuff that's been taken in from the fields, the physical material. A future is a piece of paper which is a bet. Most all of derivatives are bets. It's a bet on the price of that particular unit, in this case corn. A future is basically the farmer says, well, I know when the crop comes in 6 months, I want this sort of price, I want this price. And there's somebody comes along who knows better, who knows that Russia's going to get wiped out with bad weather, and the price of this chap's corn in the United States is going to go up. He only wants this much, so he says, I'll definitely buy that off you. And the bet is that Russia gets bad weather, the price of corn goes up, and when he buys it at that low price, which will be the spot price in 6 months' time, which will be elevated. He'll be able to guarantee a win. The clever fella that buys the future off the farmer. Now, all of this goes through the exchange, which is the Chicago Commodities Exchange, and there are dealers there that deal with all the paperwork, as it were. So that's a future. You buy, you agree to buy something at a certain price in the future. An option. An option is another derivative, and obviously none of these are just straight, because they've been going so long that there's grey areas all around them, but these are basically what they are. So future, you guarantee to buy something at a certain price. An option is that you pay a certain amount of money, say per month, for those 6 months, and as you keep paying that, and that guarantees you an option to buy, say, at the farmer's 50. The farmer wants 50. The clever fella says, I'll definitely buy that for you at 50 in 6 months, because he's betting it'll be 70. Right? So that's the future. An option is you say, well, I'll pay you a certain amount, and this will all be done through the exchange, a certain amount each month up till that date to give me the option to buy at 50. And if when the time arrives and it's gone to 70, or a number that I think's elevated enough, I shall exercise that option and buy that off you. But I've got the option not to buy it off you, and you've got the payments that I've paid up to then, or one single payment it's more likely to be. Up to then, you've got that in recompense for me not buying it. You've still got your corn, if that's what it is, and you've got the fee that I've paid you for the option to buy it. Okay, so that's options. Futures, options. Let's get out of commodity markets and go to swaps. You can get swaptions now as well, but we won't go into them. A swap. Now, the swaps, surprisingly, for millions of different things. I can't think of a commodities one off the top of my head that'd be easy. Let's go back to the first one. The first swap, or the first big swap, was and I forget who brokered it, but I'm pretty sure it was IBM and one of the fancy World Bank, the World Bank and the World Bank. Now, each of those two, IBM and the World Bank, wanted to raise money in bonds, but the World Bank normally raised bonds in Swiss francs. IBM raised their bonds in dollars. But at that particular time, IBM wanted Swiss francs and the World Bank wanted dollars, or something like that. Anyway, it came to pass, back in those days, it would have been the 80s, I suppose, that there was a broker that said, well, look, you two together, you do your individual bond raises and then just swap the cash flow from them. You want the dollars, you want the you want the Swiss francs, just swap them. And that was arranged as a swap. And since then, it just, so many things you think, well, that's too awkward. Why would you ever want to do that? But there are so many reasons that one outfit can do one thing in one way and another outfit can do things in another way, and it is convenient for them just to swap. The most important thing is they hold whatever it is that's the derivative of the main contracts on their own books or on the bank's books, but then through the broker they organise to swap something over. Like it might be mortgages. Say somebody has got a fixed mortgage and somebody's got a floating rate mortgage. They leave the mortgages where they are, but the broker agrees that you want the floating rate when you've got fixed, you want fixed when you've got floating rate. So we'll agree, we sign a contract, our lawyers come in, then go away, and from now on you leave the mortgages where they are, but you will pay the fixed when that's what you want, and you pay the floating, that's what you want, although the mortgage doesn't change on the actual bank's books. Yeah, and you'd think, well, there's not many of those sort of things that could be arranged. The world is awash with people that want to swap things over. Yeah, it's really quite amazing. And there's little things, and they get these little ones, and they can get then bundles of little ones, knowing that somebody else will have got a bundle of another lots of little ones, and they swap the bundles over. And you think, well, how when you pay the lawyer's fee and the banker's fee can it ever work out? They seem to make it work out. Those are swaps, option swaps, main derivatives, credit derivatives. Credit default swaps. So let's go again to the first big credit default swap, because mortgage-backed securities and all that sort of thing really come under the heading of credit default swaps. The first one was the JPM Blythe Masters brokered deal between the Bank for Overseas Development and Exxon. It was mid-90s. Exxon had the Exxon Valdez disaster. They needed lots of cash. They needed an overdraft loan from JP Morgan, who were their bankers. But here we run into Basel I regulations, that you had the certain capital regulations that you should have. And it was going to be a big loan, $5 billion, and in 1990, mid-90s anyway, it was $5 billion was $5 billion back then. Which would it would be a loan, it would be 5 on the asset side, 5 on the liability side, either Nick or Fullweiler 5s. But you've got capital requirements which are normally a percentage of equity against your asset side. Now the asset side, equity, equity is really the more that the asset side is more than the liability side. That's what's left over as equity. That's what technically the owners of the company own. The difference when the bank's profitable, and then that can be tranched. No, I won't say tranche. That can be cut up and given to the owners. But it's whatever it is. So the equity, which is assets over liabilities, wasn't going to grow because it was going to be a 5-5 deal. But the asset side, I'm not too good on numerators and denominators. Anyway, that loan was going to put their capital position in a up to the limits or over the limits, let's say, of the Basel I agreements for capital reserves. But they couldn't deny Exxon because Exxon's obviously a good customer. So the deal obviously went through and they got their overdraft. Exxon got their overdraft. But Blythe Masters, who was in the derivatives department, we'll call it the derivatives department. And this was the start of the idea of credit default swaps. Now, what she did, where did she go? She went, to the Bank of Overseas Development. Again, that was in Switzerland. I think they are. Now, they've got lots of cash that they don't know what to do with. And they, like all banking types, they want to make safe investments. So what Blythe Masters said was, look, we will, like almost all of these deals go, we'll leave the Exxon loan on our books, but we want to sell off the risk for this completely. So who will buy the risk? So she goes over and organises the Bank for Overseas Investment, whatever it was anyway, they still work. European Bank for Overseas Development, to what you could call buy their risk off them. But what it really entailed was a contract being signed between the two of them that JP Morgan pays BEOBD a certain fee per year, and that would be considered interest for the Overseas Development Bank, and just a payment stream. And what the agreement was that they would accept that stream, but if Exxon defaulted, would take the default on their backs. But knowing that Exxon is not going to default at all, it was just free money. They were just being paid for nothing. But that got the actual risk off JP Morgan's books. Okay. Now, the interesting thing here is to say, well, what difference does that make to the Basel 1? Because it's a capital requirement. And JP Morgan were in a slightly different position back in the 90s, because they were the good bankers. They relied an awful lot that they had, because they, going back through JP Pierpont Morgan and Jack Morgan, his son, they liked their big corporate clients and to have a relationship with them. And it was still existed in the 90s, but it was about to change when the derivatives outfit in JP Morgan started making all the money, basically, and the old way of doing things just wasn't making the money. So eventually the derivatives players were all promoted above them, and the whole ethos of the bank changed. But they liked their corporate clients, so they would always they wanted to keep they couldn't sell the entire loan. They wanted to the one-to-one thing that would be an Exxon man that would deal with a JP Morgan man who would be their banker. So JP Morgan had to say, no, we're keeping the loan on our books, and probably wouldn't even bother telling them that they've sold the actual risk of it off. Anyway, so Basel, how this wasn't actually going to affect Basel, but obviously it was an advantage. So the JPM people went to the Fed and said, look, now we've sold the risk of something like this, do we still have to hold the same 8% it was for Basel 1, 8% of capital? And the Fed said, well, let us think about it. But in the end said, no, well, we don't think you should, but we're not totally happy with this because we don't really understand it. And a couple of years went by, and there were mad years of more of these derivatives going out. And because JP Morgan thought, well, this has got to be good. So they got a load more of their loans that they had already had on their books, bundled them together, and sold the risk off for the default for those as well. And said, look, Fed, we are selling all the risk off. We just don't have any risk anymore. And then it got a bit complicated, because then we got into what was the modern mortgage-backed security structure. Because the way JPM did this, God, what am I talking about this for? Oh, well, it's Sunday. The way they did this, after the Masters deal, the next bundle that they did of the old stuff that they had on their books anyway, that they bundled off, it was about 10, 15 billion, I think, the first one. They opened in the Cayman Islands an a special purpose vehicle for it, for extra tax avoidance. They bunged the supposed risk in there, and then they, owning that special purpose vehicle, bought the risk off themselves using that offshore special purpose vehicle for that, and then sold chunks of that special purpose vehicle to other people who wanted to invest in it. And you'll recognize that that's the standard mortgage-backed security scam that everybody was pulling in 2007 before it all blew up. Where do I want to go with this? Yeah, we'll stick with Basel because it's reasonably interesting, I suppose. The Fed still weren't convinced. They said, okay, in this special purpose vehicle, how much money has been put into it, to how much, insurance money, how much money is in there to back the possible losses on all these default risks that you've pulled off your main books in New York? How much money is lying offshore there? How much have you sold that special purpose vehicle for? How much is there? And they say, well, there's only this much in, which was a small percentage, obviously, but it's only it's insuring this bundle of, it could be Procter and Gamble and all sorts of other major AAA rated US companies that aren't going to default, they said. So what's the point? And they said, well, we're not completely happy because you've got all this loan out, you've got this default risk that you say you've taken care of, but the whole loan is still there. There is still, you say that the risk is 5%, but you've still got 95% of your loan sitting on your books there. If we're going to give you a good Basel I reduction, we want something done about that. So they had to do something about the actual loan that was still on their books. So they got to something called super senior, because what they were doing with these special purpose vehicles, they were starting to tranche those up to different levels of risk for that, as in the junior, the mezzanine and the senior, where the junior risk was if any of these go bust, you're the one that's going to pay it in the junior one, but we shall pay you a bigger fee, which is a bigger interest rate. The mezzanine, the medium one, you will only pay if the junior ones have been wiped out, and the senior, where you will only pay if the mezzanine and the juniors have been wiped out. You got a very small fee for that, or very small interest rate, but you knew your investment was safe. If this is investing in the offshore special purpose vehicle, all right, which was to ensure the small amount of risk on the books of the bank. So they called the books of the bank loan super senior, but they knew because it was above even senior that they would have to, they could only pay a fee that was pennies, or an interest rate which was 0.00 nothing. So who would possibly want that? And they found first, we'll deal with the firsts, AIG. And in London they had AIG's investment financial products, AIG Financial Products, Cassano, running the outfit in London. Now, for AIG, huge, the biggest insurance company in the world, AAA rated, they could take on something like this, which would be insuring the super senior tranche for pennies, because there was no risk. All it was somebody comes into the office, you sign a bit of paper, and you get a small income stream, which is very insurance-like. You've got a huge risk that you are actually insuring, which is the major bulk of the loans on the JPM's books, or whichever bank comes to use but their books. But you know, it's not going to happen because you've got the offshore vehicle, which is going to insure the risky part, and these people aren't going to default anyway, so it's a little bit of money for nothing. So AIG started signing these things, and as other banks got into the whole way of doing things, there were lots of these to sign, because when they took the offshore package and the AIG insuring the super senior tranche of the debt on their books to the Fed, who could arm twist Basel, but it was interior rules for the United States. The Fed said, okay, you now only have to hold 20% of that 8%. I'm not going to do it's 1.6. 22 to 8 to 16, move the decimal, 1.6. Now it's only 1.6% you have to hold in capital reserve against those loans. And that meant, because all the Wall Street banks were all up against their capital reserve buffers, as long as they got these derivatives jobs done with offshore accounts and then somebody taking the super senior, they could free up 6.4% that they couldn't use before, that they had to have in a reserve account, extra money that they could loan. And they all wanted, especially in the run-up to the credit crunch, everybody wanted to be hard up against their reserve buffers as much as possible. And that started the idea that these derivatives are absolutely marvellous, because you can imagine the male, generally male, but the the utter pleasure of a bean counter. If you don't know if you've never met bean counters and done any work with them, you don't understand how strange their minds are. These abacus boys, generally they're boys, but sometimes they're girls that pretend to be boys. In the old days, on the bank's books, say before in the mid-90s, you'd have a loan and the analysts would put a little note with it saying how much risk there was with this loan, say to Exxon. And the little note was, bloody hell, you know who Exxon is. They're not going to default, for goodness sake. And that's your tag of the risk. And the bean counters who put everything in columns and add everything up go, well, all right, if you say so. But now they were bringing to the bean counter a loan which stayed on the books with the risk sold offshore and the whole risk of the loan sold as super senior. The risk could go to the bean counter. The loan could go to the bean counter and no note, blank, no risk. So, bean counter, no risk. Because they could just put it in on the accounts there, no risk. No contingency risk or iffy risk or whatever. No contingencies at all. It was just solid. Put it in a column, leave it there. Absolutely orgasmic for the bean counters. They loved it. And that's what we've got now. I better stop. That's what we've got now for the credit crunch. The bean counters who do all this accounting that I keep going on about, this is all banking about double entry bookkeeping and balancing things, and bean counters. They are now getting all sorts of horrible bits of information in from their people that says we can't do these derivatives anymore because people aren't buying the offshore stuff and people aren't even buying the super senior stuff. So they are now presenting loans again to the bean counters with little tags on them saying, look, we've looked into this fella's past and they look all right. And the bean counters hate it. So it's a great big toss-up now between the whole desire is to stay with the derivatives model where they can put on their books no risk because they've sold the risk off. And they just do not want to go back to the old days of having analysts that analyse the risks of the loans on the books. They desperately want to go back to the derivatives way of doing things. And that's where we are now. And it's a great fight between which way it'll go, except there's not really much fight because you can't fight the bankers. And as long as they can get the derivatives accepted by the authorities that they're not going to come down and squash the derivatives, and then they can go out and start the confidence to sell the derivatives again, the whole derivatives thing will kick off again. But will the authorities, the powers that be, the Fed, the Bank of England and Basel, let them go and run on again with the derivatives thing? Because you can see that people are paying to sell risk off and have your books to say I've got no risk on it is obviously ludicrous. Because you're going to have counterparties for all these derivatives. Every time you've got the World Bank, OECD, IBM, Exxon, JPM, they're all writing contracts, these derivatives, with each other. For all derivatives have got counterparty risk. They're written between two people or they come through the broker, and there's always an element of that can break down. And as long as there's one element that can break down, that starts a chain reaction of it all breaking down, because nobody's got any faith in the other people that have signed all these counterparty derivatives. But generally the whole thing has to work, or half derivative thing just won't work. And they don't think going back to actually judging and balancing and accounting for risk on their books is just nothing that they want to ever go back to. Something like that. Derivatives. Love them or hate them. The banking system is wanting to go back to them. Bye.